The gaming industry back in 2008 was a different time. Well, sort of. EA was still viewed as one of the most hated corporations in America, but not because of their handling of microtransactions, that was still a few years away. Instead, most people hated them because of their acquisition strategy. You see, if you were a promising game studio back in the day, being acquired by EA was the same as receiving a terminal diagnosis. You could be the creator of one of the most popular RTS franchises of the decade, or a studio that literally created a cultural phenomenon. None of that really mattered because EA's strategy wasn't about long-term success. It was about acquiring a company and pumping out game after game until the diminishing returns inevitably led to the studio's closure. Maxis, Westwood, and Origin are just a few examples of once promising studios that were shuttered after being acquired by Electronic Arts. So with this context in mind, in 2008 a change in leadership with CEO John Riccitiello saw EA trying to reform their image. And they tried to do this not just by how they approached acquisitions, but also the type of games that they released. During this period, they greenlit a ton of unproven concepts that any previous incarnation of EA likely would have viewed as not being financially viable. One such experimental game was Mirror's Edge, DICE's attempt to craft a first-person game that's sole focus wasn't killing nondescript enemies in a Middle Eastern country, a genre which the industry was unfortunately oversaturated with at the time. As a result, Mirror's Edge felt like a breath of fresh air. In 2008, you saw games like Fallout 3, Gears of War 2, GTA 4, and many others being released. And while a lot of these could be viewed as quality games, their art styles weren't exactly what you'd call colorful. So by targeting a more stylized visual design, along with gameplay that wasn't focused on shooting bad guys, Mirror's Edge was able to grab a lot of people's attention. The only question that remained was whether or not DICE was going to be able to execute on this concept that was as unproven as they come. So let's set the stage. You'll play as Faith Connors, a runner who carries contraband as a way of circumventing the censorship of a hyper-futuristic city only referred to as the City of Glass. After going through a few quick tutorials to introduce you to the game's mechanics, you discover that your sister has been framed for the murder of an up-and-coming politician, who is viewed as too dangerous to be left alive. And I mean, he was talking about things like universal healthcare and free college. What were they gonna do, let him live? In this brief tutorial, you'll be introduced to a few other runners and your main contact, Merc. He's the one who provides you with your missions and gives you info over the phone. And I have to say that even for 2008, some of the names of these runners are pretty embarrassing. I mean, why would anyone want to be referred to as Ropeburn? Now, before we go any further, we have to talk about parkour. In the early 2000s, parkour was having its heyday, and not just in low-res YouTube videos, but now in major motion pictures. I mean, it was popping up in movies like the Bourne trilogy and even the latest Bond film. And unfortunately, parkour has aged about as well as 90s CGI, with many people nowadays just finding it more annoying than anything. The problem with parkour was that the people that engaged in it didn't just view it as a way to exercise. No, it was a way of life. Doing it made you better than other people.
It takes courage to act. Part of being hungry when you've been defeated. It takes courage.
And unfortunately, Mirror's Edge was not spared this viewpoint. If I had one criticism for the premise of the game, it's how it uses parkour and rebellion interchangeably. It seems to think that if you can do parkour, you're intrinsically going to be less susceptible to the brainwashing perpetrated against the general population.
Most didn't realize, or didn't care, and accepted them. They chose a comfortable life. Some didn't.
I don't know, I just get a kick out of picturing any other athletic endeavor being treated as this transcendent thing like parkour was. I'm a rower. I can get across large bodies of water really fast. I don't have to wait for bridges like normal people. Also, types of couriers already exist in the real world, but most of the time it's done with things like bike messengers rather than runners, since they're able to navigate cities even during rush hour by weaving in and out of traffic. And while this vocation is obviously still dangerous, it probably still has a lower mortality rate than runners because they're not literally jumping from rooftop to rooftop. Or hey, what about birds? You know, they used those in the First World War to do reconnaissance and to deliver messages, and they even do it in the second game. You might argue that the packages could be too large, but it seems like we're transporting things that just couldn't be sent digitally. So more often than not, wouldn't it just be like the size of an SD card or something? I've been fairly critical to start things off, so I wanted to transition into something that I think is still an achievement in the game's favor. Its visuals. As I mentioned before, Mirror's Edge really is a game that looks unique compared against any other game that was released at the time. The city within the game is incredibly beautiful to look at, with bright outdoor environments and expansive rooftops, all punctuated with reflective surfaces and primary colors. As a way to help guide the player, the environment will often be highlighted with red to delineate pathways, which is diegetically explained as runner vision. The thought being that someone who does this line of work for a living could naturally suss out paths to their destinations. As far as explanations go for a video game mechanic, I've definitely heard worse. If the environments had a ton of garbage, it would be really difficult to traverse the map without getting bogged down in the visual noise, which is why the utilitarian art style complements the gameplay so perfectly. I should also admit that when I first started the game, I was a bit concerned that I might have overestimated how well the game would hold up visually. This concern was mainly driven by how pixelated the text looked on my big screen, so I was thankfully surprised when I booted up the tutorial and found that the game's graphical assets still appeared crisp and detailed. Which makes me kind of curious why they didn't just use vector text, but maybe that's a game design thing that I'm just not privy to. Navigating your way through the city really is a blast, and the visuals help sell a city with a beautiful aesthetic that really has this seedy environment laying just below the surface. Beyond the red accents that the franchise has now become known for, other areas receive their own primary colors to help differentiate them. The result is a bit of variety that doesn't feel too out of place or distracting. Even in 2021, screenshots from this game would still look great as a wallpaper, and I think a lot of that has to do with the stylized graphics. I've often found that games that chase this realistic art design often age the poorest. I mean, no matter what you do, the visual fidelity in games is an endless arms race with seemingly no end. So by claiming that you have quote-unquote realistic visuals, you'll often be seen as a bad joke in just a few years. So while the in-game assets have aged beautifully, the 2D animations that represent the narrative aspects of the game are unfortunately less impressive. There's times where you might not mind them. I mean, the animation might seem a little bit stiff and the detail is definitely lacking, but you could say that it is trying to match the game's aesthetics. But then you'll notice someone walking away and realize that they didn't even animate the scene, rather they're just cropping the model so that it gets smaller and smaller until the character looks as though they're 2 feet tall. I don't know, it's just kind of weird for a game's cutscenes to look worse than the in-game art. So this kind of threw me off a little bit. It's not like it's so bad that it's completely distracting, but it definitely makes the game feel cheaper than DICE probably wanted it to. I don't want to leave things off here on a bad note, so what I will say about the visuals is that they do enhance the feeling of freerunning. The game is really at its best when Faith is running away from the police, with shots grazing pillars and glass beside her. In these moments, it really feels like DICE was able to successfully execute on their concept. And since we've already started to talk about the game's feel, let's get into its gameplay. Now, booting this game up after nearly a decade of not playing it, I thought that, after hitting my stride, I'd be running from rooftop to rooftop, trying to ensure that I kept momentum from one section to the next. I mean, after all, this is a game about getting from point A to point B as fast as possible, right? Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. Now, before we delve into this, I wanted to lay the groundwork for the game's mechanics. As a runner, you'll be able to perform all sorts of acrobatic feats, the main mechanic, of course, being running. But this is also accented by slides, jumps, wall running, and mixing them all together in a chain. When all these mechanics coalesce, you really feel the momentum. And unlike games like Assassin's Creed, where the parkour really felt pre-programmed, Mirror's Edge's movement really feels like you're the one doing it rather than the game doing it for you. And yeah, that's always been a pet peeve of mine when it came to those titles. The parkour might really look cool as a backseat gamer, but when you actually play it, you don't feel like you're the ones doing all these cool, amazing things. It ends up feeling like you might as well be watching a cutscene controlled by you moving the analog stick. Thankfully, Mirror's Edge's movement feels really deliberate, so if you make a mistake, it feels like, yeah, you made a mistake. But that also means that when you do something really cool, it feels like you earned it. So the movement in a game all about parkour looks and feels great. I guess we can call it a day, right? Well, the problem is that Mirror's Edge is a game that's very confused.
Say hello to my little friend!
To start, the game decided that it should force combat sections on the player. This was hinted at in the game's tutorial, but at the time I hoped that it was just an optional inclusion as a way of enticing fans of the FPS genre that might not otherwise check out the game. And I might not have minded this too much either if the combat simply had us beating up enemies, but there are certain sections where it really felt necessary to pick up a weapon and clear an area before you felt like you could move on. More than all of that though, the combat just isn't very fun or responsive feeling, so its inclusion feels kind of strange and not really worth it at all. Honestly, I would have much rather they just invested more time into other systems within the game. As I mentioned before, when you hit that top speed where your FOV narrows, you really feel the velocity of Faith. So when you get slowed down or come to a full stop, it really feels bad as a player, like you did something wrong. It's a bit puzzling then why the game reduces your speed so significantly after you come out of things like a roll. It should be noted that a roll is instigated by the player, and without the roll you'll simply land hard on your feet coming to a full stop. So yeah, comparatively speaking, a roll is still faster than not doing it, but it still feels like a punishment to perform a roll because you still lose a good chunk of the momentum that you had built up before you initiated it. Even things like grabbing onto pipes that are at a far distance can feel strangely like you've made an error, as Faith often gives out an exasperated grunt when she latches on. In the first few hours I played the game, I kind of assumed that I was just doing something wrong, but no, she just lets out this grunt every time you grab a pipe. Again, it's not game breaking or anything, but it's a sound cue that in any other game would signal to the player that they're hurting their character. Finally, the game itself seems to do everything in its power to stop you from getting too many free running sections in a row, often placing obstacles in the form of enemies or what I call puzzle sections in the player's way. Now, to explain what I mean by puzzle section, I'm talking about areas where you have to turn a pipe or flip a switch rather than trying to traverse the area with any kind of urgency. My best guess is that DICE saw this as a way to introduce more variety into the gameplay, but the balance between combat, puzzle, and free running sections seems to be fundamentally misunderstanding what I think many players wanted to get out of this game. I'm fine with puzzle sections here or there, but it just kept feeling like I never got to experience more than 10 minutes at a time of the free running sections that I loved so much. Ironically, the result is a game that feels like it's struggling to keep its momentum. The free running, when you actually get to experience it, is awesome. I just wish that the game stopped treating it like it was a dessert rather than the main course that it really should be. Audio-wise, I have to mention the absolutely incredible Foley work done here by DICE. Normally, Foley is that thing that you really only notice if it sounds out of place, but in Mirror's Edge, the use of footsteps thundering behind you as you run away from enemies hot on your tail can really get your blood pumping. It's so realistic that I honestly felt it eliciting an evolutionary response in me. If you've ever had your headphones on as you're walking and then a jogger runs up from behind you, you'll probably know what I mean by this. As I mentioned before, the sound of glass shattering and your pants rubbing against a roof as you slide down it really enhances the feeling you get while you're free running. On the music side of things, the game's score was created by Swedish artist Solar Fields, whose understated sound really fits in well here. It's important to remember that back in 2008, electronic genres like dubstep and house were really popular, so I have to imagine that DICE felt some pressure to have a more aggressive soundtrack. And EA has been more than willing to shoehorn dubstep where it doesn't belong.
You're never going home. You know that, bitch. The West Coast is ours!
Yeah, I'm thankful DICE ended up going with Solar Fields. On the voice acting side of things, most of it is passable, but there's no one on the cast that really gets you invested in their character or the events of the game. As much as fans of the series really connect with Faith, I think that has more to do with her unique visual design, and the fact that she thankfully doesn't look like every other video game protagonist for the time. To be completely fair, the script is what I feel is the real weak point here.
All I care about is Kate, and for her sake, I'm gonna let you go.
There just simply isn't that much time to get attached to any of these characters, and I think after playing a bit of the sequel, I was just a bit spoiled by the production value on display, so this game might have felt a bit weaker simply by comparison. Talking about characters, let's move on to the game's narrative. Now, normally the story portion of these videos is the longest. Thing is, as utilitarian as the game's art style is, the narrative is even more so. Essentially, the plot gets kicked off after Faith finds her twin sister chilling in an office with a dead body. It's pretty clear that someone wanted her to look like she just killed a politician, although what motive she would have to do this is anyone's guess. From here, we're tasked with finding out what this politician was really killed for, in the hopes that it'll exonerate your sister. I don't really mind stories that are straightforward, mind you. Some of my favorite films use well-worn tropes and just execute on them well, and that's unfortunately the pitfall of Mirror's Edge. It has no ambitions to tell a complex narrative, which again is fine, but it also doesn't execute really exceptionally on this pretty straightforward plot. Now, I've already mentioned the contentious 2D cutscenes, but more than that, I think that DICE just missed out on an opportunity to explore the City of Glass as a concept. After telling us that the city is a pseudo-dictatorship and that we're couriers meant to circumvent its surveillance, the world building just comes to a dead stop. Who are we couriers for? What are we transporting? How does this impact the world that we exist in? These are all a lot more interesting to me than a story about finding my sister's killer. And maybe I would care a little bit more about Faith's sister if they actually characterized her, but I actually had to look up her name after playing the game. She only appears about 2 times in the entire runtime, and she's not really that notable. Now before I move on any further, I'll put up a quick spoiler warning for anyone who wants to play the game fresh. To be honest, from a storyline perspective, you're probably not missing out on much, and you'll see most things coming a mile away. So the narrative has you chasing down a few leads to find this politician's real killer. First through a former runner named Jackknife, who lets you know that the dead politician's bodyguard named Ropeburn is likely involved in some way. After you infiltrate Ropeburn's office, you begin overhearing him discussing something called Project Icarus before he eventually takes a bullet from a masked assailant. Now faced with a dead end, Faith decides to investigate the security firm that's aiding the police in capturing runners. Here she discovers that Project Icarus's true function is to train Special Forces members in the ways of parkour, so that they can finally eliminate the runners completely. I want to pause here and ask why this was the most logical way of putting an end to runners. From a gameplay sense, I completely understand that this was a way to introduce an adversary that would be able to keep up with you as you run from rooftop to rooftop. But from a narrative sense, it seems pretty clear that the government already knows who's attached to the entire runner network, so would it really be that hard to track them all down? And I mean, the government's shown that it's clearly willing to kill runners for carrying contraband, so couldn't they just simply find out where they live and just deal with them that way? I don't know, when I heard of Project Icarus, I just assumed that there would be some bigger, more nefarious plan at play here. Honestly, what I thought was going to happen was that former runners that we'd met along in our travels would end up being brainwashed and pumped with experimental drugs or something to chase us down. Sure, I still think that that wouldn't be the most logical approach, but it probably would have been more narratively compelling. To get back on track, we follow Ropeburn's masked killer to a boatyard where it's revealed that Celeste, our supposed runner friend, has decided to pull a cipher. But instead of a juicy red steak, she's willing to give up her friends for a more comfortable life. I think what bugs me about this is that Celeste has this line where she says,
I want to live, Faith, not just survive.
but is living something that you really get to do when you're under a total dictatorship? Regardless, you fight her until she sort of just exits the game. Yeah, she doesn't really show up after this cutscene. From here we go to the Shard, which is where our sister is being held by another former runner, Jackknife, although we don't really know that yet. Which is again sort of puzzling because he was the one that gave us that crucial information that led us to find out about Project Icarus in the first place. I think the game at this point was just kind of hoping we'd forget that he did that by now. Anyways, he jumps on a helicopter with our sister and says,
You can't live on the edge all your life, Faith. Sooner or later, you have to jump.
Very poor choice of words.
Later in a post-credits scene, you find out that by destroying all of the security systems in the Shard, you've just intensified the city's demand for private security, which I assume was meant to be sequel bait, but Mirror's Edge Catalyst was a reboot, so that really never gets explored. And that's sort of the challenge that I have with Mirror's Edge. It doesn't really feel like it has the runway to explore the concepts and characters that it introduces. For almost the entire runtime of the game, there isn't really an antagonist except for this vague concept of the government. At the end, when it's Jackknife holding your sister at gunpoint, it really should have been Celeste in my opinion. It doesn't really feel all that cathartic to yeet Jackknife from the helicopter because we've only really seen him once before. And sure, he was a dick, but not enough to make this scene really work. I don't know, it's just Celeste betrayed us, her actions directly led to the death of our mentor and the persecution of all of our friends, so why is Jackknife the one on the helipad at the end? It just sort of feels like there's a chunk missing from the story, and that DICE had to make some significant cuts along the way to make all the pieces fit together. I know I've sounded really harsh during this story section, but I don't blame DICE. I can only imagine that while EA might have greenlit the project, I'm assuming most of the budget had to go into the R&D of making the mechanics of the game feel fluid and responsive. If Mirror's Edge was a game that had an amazing story but the free running sucked, nobody would be talking about it today. So it feels kind of stupid for me to be a nitpicky asshole about the story. It's clearly just here to get you from point A to point B and give you some fun arenas to play in. In conclusion, Mirror's Edge is a bold game that really tried to deliver on a concept that no one else really had the balls to try and attempt. Like many firsts, it stumbles along the way. The combat isn't all that fleshed out, and the puzzle section sometimes hinders the pace of the game. But what's undeniable is that the core gameplay of Mirror's Edge establishes a foundation for something really great. When you pick up momentum and find yourself sliding, wall running, and launching yourself over walls, it really does feel almost transcendent. Oh god, I'm starting to sound like one of those parkour people.
It takes courage to act.
Is Mirror's Edge the gateway drug to parkour? Now I'm guessing that people that are fans of the franchise have probably been screaming at the video saying that I should check out the sequel, and I have been curious about Catalyst, so color me surprised when I picked up the game for the first time a few weeks ago and found that all of my gripes from the original were pretty much addressed. Now when you perform things like slides or soft landings, the game allows you to pick your momentum back up a lot quicker, the free running sections of the game are a lot more common and continuous, and even the combat, something that I had honestly hoped the sequel would do away with, has instead been fleshed out. Now it's treated as another element of keeping your momentum by allowing you to perform attacks while keeping your speed. Also, the voice acting, cutscenes, and characters are light years ahead of what we got in the original.
New guy. Seems a bit uptight.
Hey, Chris? He's a good kid. He runs better than anyone.
Than anyone?
In the end, Mirror's Edge is a unique game for a lot of different reasons. It was an unconventional title published by EA of all companies. It features an Asian woman as its protagonist, and its gameplay doesn't center around shooting bad guys. So rather than sit here and complain about the ballooning costs of game development that have pretty much made it impossible for anything like Mirror's Edge to ever happen again, I think I'll celebrate the fact that the stars did align to give us something truly weird from the most unlikely of places.